In this two-part set of lectures, we will discuss immigration policy from the 1970s through the 1990s. The one thing that will unite everything that we talk about is the notion of paradox, that many different parties and interest groups had varying positions on what to do about immigrants and immigration. Any legislation that took place had to take into account each of these differing views, leading to paradoxical policy development. Policies that were put into place had to simultaneously placate those calling for restriction of immigration and the needs of business and industry that wanted to ensure a continued stream of cheap, flexible labor. Additionally, we see efforts to limit the number of immigrants coming into the country being thwarted or just sidestepped by executive orders or legislation offering admission to refugee groups, sometimes in the tens of thousands. The first part of this lecture will focus primarily on refugee admissions during the 1970s and 1980s, while the second part will focus on the reemergence of the issue of Mexican immigration in the 1970s on through the 1990s. Before getting to either of these issues, though, a bit of historical background is important. A major consequence of Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society legislative efforts and the shift in American ideology that accompanied them was the rise of the entitlement state. Immigrants came to be eligible for federal, state, and local benefits and social services, including health care, that they had never before had access to, on a much grander scale than at the turn of the century. This was all a part of a plan to create a decent society that let no one, not even the undocumented immigrant, slip through the cracks. In general, immigrants were also increasingly protected by post-civil rights sensitivity about minority issues. It became much more difficult to overtly discriminate against immigrants, whether legal or illegal. The human rights revolution really began in the United States in the late 1940s in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War, but quickly withered away under Cold War duress as security and anti-communism, somewhat ironically, trumped issues of liberty and rights. The civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 1960s, however, put human rights back on the agenda. And this was something that emerged from both sides of the political spectrum. From the left, we see tremendous concern for the rights of African Americans, for gay rights, the feminist movement, and also environmentalism. From the right, we see the view that human rights is what distinguishes the United States from the Soviet Union. For Americans of all ideological stripes, there was also tremendous embarrassment about American actions in Southeast Asia under the Johnson administration. This is key in understanding growing concern for the basic human rights of people around the world. For Presidents Nixon and Ford, human rights became a way to answer critics from the right about the failure of U.S. foreign policy, and from the left about the conduct of the nation in Southeast Asia. For Congress, advocating human rights protection was a way to distinguish itself from the wartime policies of the executive branch and proclaim a new set of values. Not to mention a great way to gain tighter oversight over executive decision-making, particularly by requiring the Department of State to issue human rights reports for the government. One of the first times we see human rights playing a major role in immigration policy was the decision in 1974 to allow Soviet Jews to enter into the United States as refugees. While one would have expected anti-communism to have been the main justification for granting refugee status, it wasn't. Entry was based primarily on notions of human rights, particularly the human right to freedom of movement. But, lest we get overly idealistic, it's important to recognize that the decision to allow Soviet Jews to come to the United States was made by Congress in the context of a U.S.-Soviet trade bill, and then various amendments that linked the freedom of immigration of Soviet Jews with the ability to trade with the United States. This was seen by many commentators to be a foreign policy victory for the United States. One of the things we can talk about in class is why this was the case. It's important to recognize that human rights alone could not bring about refugee status. We can see this very clearly in the case of Chilean dissidents who were fighting against the brutal military regime of Augusto Pinochet. They were denied entry into the United States in the 1970s, primarily because there was no clear foreign policy benefit to allowing them in. Indeed, they were fighting and fleeing a right-wing, anti-communist government that had strong American support. The next major group to be considered for refugee status in the United States were Southeast Asians fleeing the turmoil caused by the Vietnam War and subsequent fighting in Laos and Cambodia. All told, approximately 200,000 Southeast Asians were brought to the United States in the 1970s. There was no real overarching political justification for this decision. For Robert Kennedy and many liberals, this was largely an issue of American guilt, moral force, and an ongoing responsibility to the people of the region. Some, though, including President Ford, justified the action in the context of their fight against communism. This was something that was not simply the result of an executive order. Congress authorized appropriations to help resettle these refugees. In addition to the overt concern for human rights, this episode was also significant because Southeast Asians broke the quote-unquote racial barrier to refugee resettlement. Up until that point, almost all refugees had been European. There was significant backlash to the admission of so many refugees in the 1970s, particularly Southeast Asian. Some of it was, of course, racist, but much of it was economic. The United States was mired in a recession in the late 1970s, and jobs were scarce. These refugees were seen as taking jobs that should be going to ordinary Americans. The English language skills of these Southeast Asian refugees were also weaker than previous immigrant groups. Their education levels were low, and their familiarity with Western culture was almost non-existent, making them seem very much different than the mainstream population. Another important thing to remember is that many Southeast Asian refugees collected welfare checks and other forms of taxpayer-supported services when they first arrived. This angered many Americans who were not getting the help that they needed from the government, or who felt that the government could do more for them if there were more resources available. This backlash had very little effect on the actual admission of refugees in the United States from the 1970s through the early 1990s, when refugee admissions peaked. Since 9/11, however, numbers have been dramatically down, and we're admitting far fewer refugees into the country today than we did in the 1970s. With this, we conclude the first part of the lecture on immigration policy from the 1970s through the 1990s.